Nobody walks into a pawn shop expecting to hold a piece of rock and roll history. That's not how pawn shops work. You go in, somebody shows up with a watch or a coin or their grandmother's jewelry. Rick, the spotter, Harrison lowballs them. They haggle for 10 minutes. Everybody shakes hands and goes home. That's how it works. But then Landon walked in with that case. Rick probably assumed it was going to be business as usual, only it wasn't. Inside was a 1941 Gibson SJ200. Now, if you're not a guitar person, that name probably means nothing to you right now. But by the end of this, it will. Because what sat in that case wasn't just an old guitar. It was one of maybe a few dozen instruments that were ever made, ever. And on top of that, this specific one had belonged to Stephen Stills. Rick looked at it and said he would absolutely love to get his hands on it, which, if you've watched even a few episodes of Pawn Stars, you know is not something Rick Harrison says. The man negotiates for sport. He's been doing it since before most of us were born. So what was it about this guitar that got to him? Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why this moment hit the way it did, you first need to understand what a 1941 Gibson SJ200 actually is. Gibson started making the SJ200 in 1938. At the time, they called it the Jumbo, and it was the finest guitar Gibson had ever built, the highest quality materials, the most meticulous craftsmanship, and a price tag that put it completely out of reach for most people. It was the kind of instrument that serious musicians dreamed about owning. And then on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. Everything changed overnight. Factories that were making furniture started making ammunition. Companies that built appliances switched to military equipment, and Gibson was no different. Production on the SJ200 stopped cold, and it stayed that way for years. That 3-year window, 1938 to 1941, is all the time Gibson had to make these guitars. When you think about production capacity and the wartime halt, estimates suggest only a few dozen of these instruments were ever completed. Some collectors think the number might be even lower than that. Either way, finding one today is the kind of thing that vintage guitar hunters spend their entire lives chasing. They show up at estate sales in the rain, comb through storage auctions, and follow every lead that goes nowhere for years, all hoping to stumble onto one. When guitar expert Jesse Amoroso walked into the pawn shop and saw what Landon had brought in, his reaction was more or less a confirmation. He held it carefully, the way you hold something you're terrified of dropping, and his assessment was immediate. This was the real thing, a 1941 SJ200 sitting right in front of him in a Las Vegas pawn shop. The guitar wasn't in perfect condition. There were cracks. There were old repairs visible on the body, but that's actually part of what makes a guitar like this credible. The wear on this one was consistent with its age and its history was where things got genuinely extraordinary. If you grew up in the 1960s and 70s, you already know who Stephen Stills is. If you didn't, here's the short version. Stills was a co-founder of Buffalo Springfield, one of the most influential bands of the 1960s. He was also a co-founder of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and later Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. In 1969, that supergroup recorded Deja Vu, an album that music historians still point to as one of the greatest records ever made. Stills was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice on the same day, once for Buffalo Springfield and once for CSNY. That almost never happens. What made the guitar even more significant in this moment was that Stephen Stills was still alive, touring and creating. In other words, this was a physical object that connected you directly to a living legend, someone you could theoretically call on the phone right now. But here's what really sealed it. Landon didn't just bring the guitar, he brought the documentation. A signed bill of sale from Stephen Stills himself, verifying the sale of a Gibson J200 guitar. That piece of paper eliminated every question anyone could raise about authenticity or provenance. This was now a guitar with a paper trail that went straight back to the man himself. Rick understood immediately what he was looking at. Jesse Amoroso is a serious guitar expert, and when he finished his examination, he didn't dance around the numbers. As a vintage guitar on its own, with no famous owner attached to it whatsoever, a 1941 Gibson SJ200 in this condition was worth somewhere between $75,000 and $90,000. That alone would make it one of the more significant items ever to come through the gold and silver pawn shop. The Stills connection, backed by that bill of sale, added another $20,000 to $30,000 on top of that. So you're looking at a total valuation somewhere between $95,000 and $120,000. Landon's asking price was $110,000, and that's when Rick Harrison had to figure out who he wanted to be in this particular moment. Rick went through the process. He examined the bill of sale. He had his team look at the guitar. He asked the right questions. That part was normal. But something was clearly happening underneath all of it. He kept coming back to the guitar itself, kept returning to what it represented, and you could see him working through something that wasn't purely financial. Rick Harrison built what he built by being unsentimental about money. That's genuinely one of his skills. But he's also someone who has spent his career around objects that carry history, and this guitar was carrying a lot of it. The negotiation moved up through the numbers. $90,000, $95,000. Rick landed on $85,000, and Landon said yes immediately. However, later, Landon revealed that $85,000 was actually above his real bottom line. He would have taken less, which means Rick, one of the sharpest negotiators in the business, paid more than he had to for this guitar. He bought it for $85,000, knowing the valuation went up to $120,000, and knowing he could likely sell it for more than he paid. The margin was still there, but that's not really why he bought it, and everyone watching could sense that. He bought it because he forgot just for a little while to be purely transactional about it. The Stephen Stills guitar is probably the most emotionally charged transaction in Pawn Stars history, but not necessarily the most significant one. A man came in once with more than 200 pounds of silver he had bought years earlier on his father's advice. He held on to it for over a decade while the market climbed steadily. When he finally walked into the gold and silver, he was cashing out at the right moment. Rick tested the bars, drilling into them to verify purity in that way that always makes sellers look like they want to disappear, confirmed everything checked out, and paid $111,000. A 1932 Lincoln Roadster showed up with a V12 engine and a body that looked like it had come straight off a showroom floor. Rick and the old man both knew what they were seeing. Cars like that don't come available often, and when they do, you move fast. They paid $95,000 in cash. The seller then turned around and immediately spent the entire amount on gold, right there at the counter. Same bills and different asset class, all in one transaction. JFK's cigar box from the Oval Office, verified, complete with several unsmoked cigars still inside. Rick knew that another Kennedy cigar box had sold for over $500,000 in the 1990s. He bought this one for $60,000. Then there was Vic Flick, who walked in carrying his 1961 Fender Stratocaster. Vic Flick is the guitarist who played the original James Bond theme. Yes, that riff, the one you can hear in your head right now without even trying. The same guitar had been used on recordings with Tom Jones and the Beatles. Rick paid $55,000, and neither man had to say much to each other to understand why the deal made sense. Conclusion. And honestly, when you look at all of it together, it starts to make sense in a way that has nothing to do with business. Rick didn't build what he built by being the cheapest guy in the room. He built it because he genuinely understands what things mean. Not just what they're worth on paper, what they actually mean. And most of the time, those two things are close enough that it doesn't matter. But every once in a while, something comes through that door that separates them, and those are the deals nobody forgets. This guitar was one of them. Made in a tiny window before a world war changed everything, played by a man who helped shape what rock music became, sitting on that counter with a signed piece of paper that confirmed every word of the story. And Rick, who has made a career out of never paying more than he has to, paid more than he had to, and he knew it too. You could tell. So we're curious about you. Something like this falls into your hands with real history, real proof, and a real story behind it. Do you take the money when it's right, or is there a version of this where no number is enough? Let us know what you think down in the comments.